Um, in the previous sessions, we actually discussed quite a few different Chinese elite art genres. And in this session, I guess I want to fill up one blank that's somehow overlooked by many, both inside and outside what is today China. Um, which I personally believe it has a lot to do with the Daoism as a tradition or traditional influence on the aesthetic values of the ancient Chinese elites, which is a lot of people, I guess, misunderstood what the Japanese refer to as bonsai. Bonsai basically are two Chinese characters exactly the same as the Chinese who pronounce as penzai. So penzai literally translated into English would be uh, potted plants, meaning you grow the plants in a pot rather than out there in a garden. So between the garden grow plants and the potted plant, what would be the major differences here? Well, uh, I mentioned earlier, I've been creating a gardening space in a very, I guess, ancient, authentically ancient Chinese landscaping theory and the system. So I want to first talk a little bit about the Chinese landscaping before we move on to the next, which is what we're gonna, primarily talk about in this session. The Chinese landscaping, of course, first, being a Taoist, you want to make sure the four directions, the south, the north, east, and west, right? So each one as a very specific symbol, and that's what they call the four symbols instead of calling four directions, right? In Chinese, it's people pronounce that 四象, the four symbols. Each one, sit in a, it's symbols of the real animals and the imaginary animals. So the four basically symbolize the four different directions. So on the east side, um, which that's one direction obviously, and then the west side, right? So east side basically represent what is called blue dragon, and that's the animal sitting on the east side, and then on the west side it's the white tiger. Um, this is actually very significant about people's fortune, but it's not just or not even about, or you can say not just about your money or financial fortune. It has a lot to do with the whole, I guess, luck. You want to improve your luck. Well, theoretically, the moment you were born, basically the fate is already set. You can't really change that. But what you could do with the feng shui arrangement, you can improve on the luck, which is one is on the strategic level, the other is on the tactical level, right? You can change your little luck here and there by improving the odds. So the whole Chinese landscaping is all about how to improve the lucks of this household. In the old days, the Chinese architecture, they separate the front yard from the backyard. In fact, not just the yard, the front section and the back section. The front section is really for the official functions and the social functions. And remember, back in the old days, the women were not supposed to come out and join the head of the household in social activities. No. So the front were pretty much restricted to the head of the household, of course, male, and whatever the the business. So if you were back then one of the Chinese elites, that means you had your official capacity, taking some kind of public role as a government of or court officials, right? So, and remember, at least in Beijing, all those court officials, all their official residences were provided by the royal court. So they had nothing to do like a design or build, but everything was in very specifically defined protocols, okay, proper for your royal court ranking, the social standing, and people could tell by walking, by your residence. They look at the decorations outside, uh, the size, the dimension, the color, everything. They could tell exactly, are you a civilian official, or you're a some kind of general, in the military ranks, and exactly what pay grade you're at. Everything very clear, right? So that's your primary residence, provided by the royal court. If you are a Chinese elite, there's no way you pay for your own residence, because they provide it for you and make sure it is proper, right? Because if you try to have a bigger, in size, the residence, you may, either go to jail or have your head, chopped off. That's very serious business. Now back to the landscaping. The landscaping typically would be for the secondary residence, which is basically owned and occupied by the Chinese elite. Remember, the primary ones were provided by the royal court. So when the royal court provide this kind of courtyard complexes, especially in Beijing, would be like what they call four-sided courtyard uh, residence. Why four-side? Four-side because the directions have to be very clear. Beijing, as a capital city, probably the only one around the globe, started the master planning at the city level from somewhere around 3,000 years ago. Okay, so when Ming Dynasty moved from the south capital to the north capital, which is Beijing today, they actually did lots of work to basically expand in scale, but went along with the feng shui thing, which is basically, in essence, the Daoist stuff. So back to the point, the landscaping for the royalties, absolutely, they have to identify what they call the dragon. The word would be the map of where the dragon. They always have to identify one. In the Mother Nature, symbolize somewhere. Typically, it has a lot to do with certain mountains, certain shapes, certain you know possessions of the supposedly the dragon around, and their capital has to be constructed right around there in certain position, line up, alignment. But then if you're not a some kind of emperor, you don't care about the dragon, but still, within your own secondary residence, you do want to consider, right? So once again, the primary residence, the front, half or somewhere nearly half, you would see basically, at least in Beijing, was very specific. Okay, you visit somebody's household, right? You never ever sit, facing, either south or north. In most cases, facing north, because that's the seat for the head of the household. unless you're the emperor or you have much higher social ranking, or more likely the royal court ranking than the head of the household, you never get to sit facing north. The That part is part of the protocol. Okay, so the main, the host, their seats are basically facing north. But let's say you're the government official and you're either at the same, uh, and you're visiting on official business, right? You're somewhere, somewhere like at the similar ranking as mine. You'll probably get a seat right next to me facing north. Other than that, you will be politely asked to sit either on this east side facing west or west side facing east. But that's always the protocol. That's the designated seats for the guests. You got to, either sit here or there as designated by your host. You cannot just, oh, let me just sit here and there. No, that's extremely rude. That was the protocol back then. So we just talk about this because it has not to do with direction, right? To the point, even when I was, a young boy, people from Beijing, born and raised there, they don't say, oh, go to left, go to right. They will always go like, oh, let's move a little bit toward the south, or let's move a little bit, toward the north. It's always the fourth direction, very clearly for people from Beijing. And also, you go to Shanghai, you see this, zigzag road. You never see that in Beijing, at least in the old days. Everything is just straight, to clearly identify the direction. Why? Because once again, the four direction has a lot to do with the yin yang, with all that, feng shui stuff. So when your primary residence is like this, oh, I forgot to mention. I only talk about the front part. In the traditional Chinese, especially Beijing, the official residence, you would have the front gate. You push open, and then the first one on your right, typically, there's a little teeny tiny setup. That's where the doorman live. Okay, so the doorman live there only because doorman, his job is to, open the door, because when people come, and call on and knock at the door, doorman open the door. Oh, what can I do for you, sir? So this visitor would produce a name card. A name card has been in China for more than 1,000 years. Of course, they didn't have cell phone. They couldn't make appointment. So they present the name card, which basically their title, telling a little bit of bio, we say today, on that card. So at the beginning of the card, it could be about this size, and then get only a little, smaller. So if you are a Chinese elite, you would address certain way and basically, politely, hint that you are a gentleman too. So that's more likely the doorman would get you the, to see the host. And if you're not, you're going to have to come back and, take the message from the doorman and say, oh, would the host be ready to see me and when? That was the thing. So you pass beyond that. Again, in any Chinese back then, the courtyard residence, you cannot see through, okay? So there's always a wall blocking the view. You open the gate, you go into the first little yard, and you see a wall. So that doorman lives right by that wall, okay? So if you're allowed to go in, then you go past this, the doorman will basically accompany you and take you on this tour. So you pass this first wall and then zigzag going. If you're really, really high ranking court officials, you would have 3, courtyards in a complex, okay? You cannot have more than that. More than that, you're basically royalties, up to, I think, 5 courtyards. So this is the complex, right? It's more complicated than the Mongolians because it was the Mongols who invented all this courtyard business. but they did not have any like a hierarchy. So regardless of the social ranking, they were all enjoying the same size, exactly same dimension, from the king to the man, general serving under, for under serving the king. They were all the same. But the Ming Dynasty, because this Confucianism, you gotta have this, very strict, ranking differentiated. So, nevertheless, um, remember, this is all about the first uh, primary resident, right? So the first part, they will invite you in if the host is ready to see you, uh, and you will be served with the tea. But the tea, you do not dare to, pick it up and drink. When they tell you, oh, the tea is served, that's a very polite indication you got it. You move your ass and go. So you don't really get to drink the tea. That's just symbolic, polite protocol to serve, but you don't drink. Okay, but all that is all about all the official business in the front side, right? So passing the second gate will be the back end. The back end, basically, the family members of the official. They basically, I guess, restricted their family social in the backyard, okay, or in the house. And that part, the second gate, a gentleman will never ever try to pass through the second gate. Why? You're not going to mess with my female family members in the back there, my wife, my daughters. How dare you? If you do that, I'm going to send you to jail. So that was why the backyard pretty much is, restricted for the private activities. The people, the social callers, never pass beyond that. That's a restricted border. Okay, you need to stop right there. No, all access from the outsiders would have to be basically stopped right here, the second gate. Now, this tradition was carried over into the secondary residences, except for the secondary residence for the Chinese elite back then. They were really for social between the Chinese elites. The Chinese family members may have some activities in there, but that's not really for them. That's really just for the guys, get high and then produce this calligraphy, Chinese, ink brush painting, or poetry, or music, that kind of thing. So the secondary residence now comes to the landscaping. Now we're finally I'm not even sure I get to talk about the bonsai. Probably the bonsai part would have to be in a separate session. So anyway, the landscaping of the secondary residence of the Chinese elites, first of all, where they do differ from the Japanese, everything had to look like very natural. You can't really make it fakely pretty. No. Okay. You still appreciate the Mother Nature, but it has to look just like a replication of Mother Nature. Of course, actually, it's not just a random replication. You still design, and it takes a lot of work, but you cannot show all that work. Just like today, if a woman, after 4 or 5 hours of makeup, the best one is you could barely tell that there was a makeup. It just make it look like, oh, she just looked like that, from birth. That's the best makeup, right? And if you're in the movie business, or it doesn't have to be movie, let's say either TV or photography, right? So the lighting, the best lighting, you cannot even tell. It's like this is just basically just outdoor. You cannot tell it was indoor. That's the best lighting. Or painting, right? You spend all this effort and time just to try to make it look like You did it just like that. By the same token, the Chinese ancient landscaping design was all about, not to show any, I mean, any human touch. Okay? Make it look like, oh, it has been like that for several hundred years or 1,000 years. That's the best Chinese design. That's that. And number two, no vanity. You want to stay low profile. You don't want to, attract the attention. And, one, people, that's, you can get people really envy, and jealousy can produce lots of tragedy. So stay low profile. Um, Even though your primary residence, you're probably, showing, and you didn't do that. The court did that. The royal court provided this official residence as your primary. It shows your proper ranking, but your secondary, you don't want to do that. No, you want to make it look like some, cottage, owned by a farmer, something like that. At least on the outside, right? And then that's basically try to stay out of the conflicts that could be potentially generated, from jealousy. But on the other end, remember I mentioned earlier, when you are reaching the peak point, what does that mean? That means you already passed the perfection and you are on your way down. So people always want to reserve a little room for more, I guess, elevations, right? So for that purpose, you want to stay away from the vanity. You want to stay low profile. So how is that going to be reflected? Most of the plants, they're not going to be loud in color. They're not going to be too bright. Evergreen type of plants would be perfect, and you try to hide all those. In fact, it's not a really good idea to have lots of very exotic and brightly pretty, strikingly beautiful flowers in your garden. That's just not wise, or at least it was not considered wise to have that in your landscaping design for your own secondary residence. So we talked about that. So when you in your design, so basically there's certain themes. Everyone has to have certain themes. But if you were in Beijing, typically almost no one has the water access. Beijing. That's why the Mongolians, when they came to Beijing, everywhere has a little like water. A pool of water. Not even a pond. They would call it sea. They call it 海子, meaning a small sea. What it is, just a small pool of water. And so for anyone to have a secondary residence, they actually have like a lake. Forget about it. That's not going to happen in Beijing. Okay, the natural water is not there, and to dig out some kind of a reservoir, that's a big project. You don't want to do that because you could cause the suspicion of the emperor. It's like, so you have more money now. Where did you get all that money? You want to stay low profile to save your neck. That's that. So, but if you're in the south, of course, there are lots of water resources, so the theme would be totally different. But in any way, if you have a little gazebo, which you always do, what's that? What purpose does that serve? When you have these social visitors, you guys, basically get high with all these banquets and all these nice drinks, and then you guys basically, have a party, basically collaborating in between the calligraphy, the painting, ink brush painting, poetry, and all that, right? And if you don't have the social visitors, you probably use that gazebo. You sit there sipping your tea. You may or may not have the musical instrument, but you enjoy your, lone time, which is, of course, very nice. So this is all about the landscaping, right? So basically, two primary functions. One is to social with the other Chinese elites for the artistic creation parties. You get social, you get a high, but then at the end of this party, you will have a whole bunch of artworks created, and that's how they, started to collect the artworks, of each other, and they circulate, right? So back then, it would be too low to try to sell. Nobody did that. It just basically, oh, you like it? Oh, here it is. That's for you. They kind of give to each other. Of course, if I'm so established, do I just easily give everybody, that? But remember, whoever gets to be, invited and present themselves in my secondary residence in the garden, that's not a random person. You have to somehow find yourself worthy of an invitation, eh? So in any case, that was all about the landscape design for the Chinese elite in the old days, in the ancient Chinese society, right? So I guess I'm gonna have to save the portion about the bonsai in the next session. So until then, ciao.